We are 25 minutes into our recording slot.
Oh, God, are we? Let's go.
We're 25 minutes in and we haven't even started.
God, we could make a Patreon bonus out of this.
Yeah, I'll just sit. Do you know what? Yeah, I'll just start recording as soon as we join the voice call, and we'll just make a Patreon bonus of Simon and Ella talk absolute
And talk
Simon
shit,
and Ella
yeah.
talk absolute bullshit.
Let's do it. Okay, let's go.
Hello and welcome back to Rails to Nowhere. I am, of course, Simon, and joining me yet again is the fantastic Ella.
Hello.
And today we are rounding up the sessions on London transport in the 1930s. We have come to the end of my dissertation. We are looking a little bit ahead into the post-Second World War period and sort of reflecting on what we've talked about and doing the thing that I think is very important and sort of thinking about how it reflects on what's going on now and how it teaches us about the future. First, to have a glance at what happened with the New Works programme and the London transport developments during and immediately after the Second World War. So the New Works programme, as I've alluded to various points throughout this, was largely stopped during the Second World War. A small number of the nearly completed works opened between 1939 and 1941, but from 1940 the LPTB is effectively nationalised, and at that point work just sort of completely stops on these projects. Various bits of the project's infrastructure is used for the war effort, so the depots at Aldenham, Hainault and West Ruislip are turned over to war manufacturing for a mix of, I believe they do a mix of aircraft and tank manufacturing.
That feels right. A lot of railway companies were contracted to manufacture tanks and aircraft in particular because of the machinery involved.
I feel like Aldenham and Hainault depots are mostly used for road-based vehicles, and I think West Ruislip is used a bit for aircraft because of its proximity to Northolt.
Yes, I believe it was it has something to do with either Spitfires or Hurricanes, one of the two.
Yeah. Well, one that definitely has a role with Spitfires is the tunnels between Leytonstone and Newbury Park. Around Gants Hill, they're converted into a factory that produces parts for the Plessey Company as a bomb-proof factory, and Plessey produce bits that go into, I believe it's the Merlin engine, which specifically is the one that goes in the Spitfire.
Yes, and also goes in a couple of tanks too after they get shot down.
Yeah. And so they're producing bits and pieces on behalf of like Rolls-Royce to go into their engines and things. And other bits of the tunnels are used as air raid shelters. So around Bethnal Green, the running tunnel is used as an air raid shelter for civilians. There's also some additional tunnelling work that happens during the Second World War. Some extra tunnels are constructed along certain Northern Line stations, notably around Clapham and Camden Town. These are constructed to be deep-level shelters. They are built by the LPTB on the pretense that they could become part of a express Northern Line that had been there'd been talks about express tubes since the 1920s. I recently shared on our Twitter and our Instagram some pictures I got from the London Transport Archive of 1920s plans for an express combined Piccadilly and Northern Line monstrosity, and these air raid shelters are constructed on the pretense that they could form part of an express Northern Line after the war.
I think that's an interesting point to explore as well quickly, is that we see, especially in America, systems going for express running, most notably New York, whereas in the UK, especially in London, it's something that's not really considered, even though it potentially would have some value. Yes. But then when I think it's interesting then to consider the suburban rail network as the replacement for the UK's equivalent of the express running.
Yeah, so you've got sort of some places in London where you kind of have that, because you have Well, in the Underground, you have two places where there is express local running for the Underground. You've got the Met and the Jubilee between Finchley, or between Baker Street, Wembley Park, and Harrow on the Hill, and you have the District and the Piccadilly line between South Kensington and Acton Town.
Yes.
But as you say, you also get one or two places where the suburban network provides that. So, for example, between
Upminster,
Fenchurch Street and Upminster, you get the District and the C2C providing that sort of layout.
I think even in places like between Wimbledon and Waterloo, Westminster and Embankment area, you get the suburban network fill that gap. And there's a few other places.
It's a little less obvious in some of those other places, but it is still there when you think about it, yeah.
Yes, and even things like Watford Junction towards Euston, that's a network that I would argue has express running available.
Yes. And so that
it certainly exists, but isn't something considered really by the LPTB, which I find really interesting.
Yes. Yeah, and those bits of express running that we've just talked about, where they're explicitly express and local running, those all predate the LPTB. The four-tracking of the Metropolitan Railway was done in the 1880s. The express Piccadilly line between Hammersmith and Acton Town and then into South Kensington, that was all a district railway plan from the 1880s. The Bowchurch up to Upminster section of the district line running alongside the LMS, that was all late 1800s. So this all predates the Underground, the LPTB coming into being. They don't really advance any of these ideas. And as I say, the only things I've seen mention of are the idea of the Express Piccadilly and Northern Tube, which is put forward in the 1920s by the UERL, but that doesn't really go anywhere. And then there's vague thoughts about this Express Northern Line, but that essentially gets killed off by the Second World War, because following the Second World War, the Underground is heavily damaged, the trams are heavily damaged, the buses are heavily damaged, so there's no money to invest in a new line or in expansions. Most of the Northern Heights projects, so that's what was planned for extensions northwards on the Northern Line, are scrapped. Tiny little bits of that get completed off after the Second World War, but mostly it's just scrapped. This is why you have the Rump Mill Hill East shuttle, because that was meant to go all the way up to Edgware.
And it's why that's also the primary route too, when you actually look at it in terms of track geometry out of Finchley Central.
That's because that was the route out of King's Cross, because the route out of King's Cross used to come Finsbury Park up to Highgate, up to Finchley Central and across to Edgware. So that was the principal LNER route that London Transport took over. Primarily, funding is put towards the Central Line, which gets most of its works done, although the line out to Ongar would not be electrified until 1957, and it never reaches its full western extent of going to Denham beyond West Ruislip. This is why there's still a bit of track beyond West Ruislip, and it's very obviously a through station that just happens to be where the line ends now. And the trams get a small reprieve because of the war. So because of the money that's been having to spent on maintaining the Underground and the fact that bus manufacturing has been first turned over to the war effort during the war and then is desperately trying to replace those vehicles that have been damaged during the war, because there's a couple of notable instances where, for example, bombs land on Underground depots or bus depots as well, and destroy many vehicles just in one go. So there's a desperate attempt to just build enough buses to run the bus service that's meant to be running, never mind without replacing the trams. But the first generation of trams closes in 1952. So following the Second World War, we're basically seeing most of the Underground Group's plans being paused. We're seeing the New Works programme essentially come to an end. The last vestiges of it would be finished in 1962, I want to say. I forgot to note this bit down, which is when the electrification of the Metropolitan line reaches Amersham. But it never goes all the way to Aylesbury, as had initially been expected. But it's extended beyond Rickmansworth up to Amersham, and you get the A60 stock come in, which was the result of the sort of tests that had been done during the interwar period on some of the Q stock to test new door mechanisms and all that sort of stuff and bring in these new trains. But the big advance for London transport in this period is a change of ownership. Talked way back at the beginning of all of this with Aaron about the London Passenger Transport Act in 1933 and about how that all came about through to lack of satisfaction with the way the system had been running. But in 1948, the LPTB ceases to be with the formation of the British Transport Commission, which is the nationalised body that Attlee's government sets up in 1948 using the Transport Act 1947 to run. Well, if we think back to our first episode and our first bonus episode about the Railway Act 1921 and Eric Geddes, essentially to achieve his ambitions from 1921 and nationalise all of the transport in Britain and bring it under one publicly controlled authority. It is important to note that the LPTB before 1948 is not de jure a nationalised industry. From 1940, it is essentially de facto a nationalised industry and being controlled and paid for by the state, but it is officially owned by stocks and shares, the majority of which are traded on the London Stock Exchange. It is essentially a quango, although the term quango has a slightly different meaning now as it did in the 1920s. The only organisation that remains that is still largely governed in the same way as it was in the 1920s, that is akin to the LPTB, is the BBC.
Yes.
At the time, there were a number of similar organisations, so the Forestry Commission and the Central Electricity Board as it existed in the 1920s. Note, there have been about, I was looking at this earlier, there have been about 8 different iterations of the Central Electricity Board, which have all had different ownership structures. But the CEB, as it existed in 1926, those were all sort of similarly set up.
Yeah.
But it's an arm's length organisation. Unlike the BBC, it's owned by private shareholders. And unlike the BBC, it was required to operate without any subsidy. This is a thing, obviously, we've come up with BR as well, is that BR was expected to operate without subsidy eventually. But the LPTB was required to operate without subsidy, and it did operate without subsidy.
And that, I think, is quite important to highlight, and it shows how important I suppose if anything, it shows how different it is to something like BR, in that it was able to meet its requirement to operate without a subsidy, whereas BR struggled to do so. And for other reasons, I've been looking into the privatisation of British Rail, how towards the end, as the government started selling off the ancillary parts of British Rail, how it became more and more subsidy dependent, because the few things that did make money for it were cut off and were not replaced by anything but a subsidy.
It's important, though, to note that the LPTB operates with a subsidy of sorts, in that it gets good terms on government loans.
Yes.
So the UERL gets some government loans in the 1920s as a direct response to the post-war depressions, and the LPTB, again, it's working against the climate of the Great Depression, and it gets loans off the government at favourable interest rates. So it's sort of getting a subsidy in sorts because the government is not charging it as much interest as private banks would, but it is expected to, and it is paying off those loans with fair revenue and its other income. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that governance of the LPTB is weird. And I still don't quite get my head fully around how the LPTB is governed in this period. This is not necessarily my area of expertise in sort of corporate governance and all of that sort of stuff. But it is arm's length from the government, and there's actually very little oversight. Fowler argues that it actually was largely unaccountable to government. It's somewhere between a halfway house between the full-on nationalisation and the Big Four, so it's not quite completely independent of government like the Big Four is, but it is not completely under government control like, as Ella says, BR would be post-1948. And even Frank Pick admits that in trying to flee from the plight of competition, the LPTB fell into management dictatorship. And that's the words he used. He calls it a dictatorship. And Fowler's assessment of this is essentially that it appears that we were really lucky in who happened to be the most qualified people to run the LPTB at the time it was formed. Because Pick and Ashfield end up being really public service focused. They end up focusing on providing the public service and improving the network, and actually breaking the legislation that created the LPTB, because to placate the shareholders of the UERL and Thomas Tilling and all the other predecessor organisations, they were told they would be guaranteed a certain dividend percentage every year, that they get such and such payment every year. And yes, the LPTB continues to pay some of their more valuable shareholders, and I think some of the more sort of the ones that have traded on the stock exchange, what they're required to. The less valuable ones, and the ones that are paid to organisations like the LCC and some of the local councils who run, because they're paid because they own the tramway, because the tracks on the trams is owned still by the local council because it's the road and all of that.
We don't have TfL roads
at this point. So essentially, they become shareholders in LT to enable LT to operate on their tracks. But they don't pay them what they're supposed to pay them. And Fowler notes that actually we could have had a completely different system where the different people being in charge would have resulted in a system where they focused on the shareholder payments and they focused on the dividends to the detriment of the passenger and the public service. It's not to say it was perfect for the passenger. There's many complaints, and the fares were apparently complete and utter bedlam.
Which is, I'd say it's something that is unusual in Europe at this point.
Yeah. It's partially because it's still using the sort of Edmondson-style distance-based ticketing.
Yes.
Rather than the zonal ticketing that we're used to now. That's a big revolution in the 1980s, the move to the zonal ticketing. And fares fair, although fares fair doesn't completely work out as intended, because it turns out that some people felt that fares fair was fares are unfair. And it turns out that the High Court agreed with that assessment.
But it's this note that in London we're still going for very much a strong passenger pays.
Yes.
For everything, rather than a more, well, passenger pays for access, but maybe not necessarily for the entire upkeep of the system.
Yes, and the result of that is that fares are reasonably high, and wages are not terrible. Like, wages are, they're good compared to many other jobs, but working hours and working conditions are long and arduous, which means, yes, you're getting a reasonable pay, but you're not getting as many days off or as much time off as we might expect now. So, essentially, wages are lower and fares are much higher, and that's making sure that it's paying its way. Of course, come the election of Attlee's government in 1945, this comes to a head. It had long been the case that the government and ministers and parliament had been a little bit unhappy with this arrangement, because essentially to make money, the LPTB was reliant on good value loans from the Treasury. Yes, not subsidy directly, but as we say, a subsidy of sorts. But it was largely unaccountable to them, and it was largely just doing stuff with its own discretion and doing whatever it wanted. And so there was a lot of unhappiness in Parliament. And so in 1945, the Attlee government comes in and they decide they're going to do full-on nationalisation. So this is when the first change to the Central Electricity Board happens as well, and they nationalise large chunks of the UK economy, including the LPTB, which they bring into the British Transport Commission. It's the one and only time that London Transport and the National Railways are run by the same organisation, because you briefly get the British Transport Executive and the British Rail
Commission
Board and the London Transport Board under the British Transport Commission.
Yes.
Because then I was getting confused, because then they are later split into the British Rail Executive and the London Transport Executive, and that's when the British Transport Commission is kind of dissolved, and they and they part company at the point they become executives. They part companies. This is also why sometimes when I refer to the London Transport Board when talking about the London Passenger Transport Board, I'm technically talking wrong because the London Transport Board doesn't exist until 1945 or 48.
It's very confusing.
Yeah.
It's a lot. I think part of this is just politics as well.
Yeah.
This naming and how this structure, but it's also very important to understanding how things actually end up shaking out, I think.
Yeah. Hello, it's Simon. Sorry for the brief interruption to the show. First of all, a really big thank you for listening. It means a huge amount to me and Ella that so many people enjoy listening to our ramblings about railway and transport history, and we really enjoy that we're able to bring this information and research to so many people. If you'd like to help us to spread the message even further and to help us to make Rails to Nowhere even better, then you can do so over at patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere. You can support us for as little as £2 per month, and in doing so, we send you some thanks, such as early access to all of our episodes, some extra bonus episodes, of which you'll have heard some snippets here on the free feed, and we send you some periodic written updates about how the podcast is progressing. So thank you for listening. Thank you especially to our patrons for supporting the creation of Rails to Nowhere. We couldn't do this without any of you, regardless of whether you're paying us or not. This podcast would be nothing without listeners. It's a huge amount to both of us. Thank you very much. And now I'll let you get back to listening to the show. And so this brings London's transport and London Transport into the purview of central government. It brings it properly under government control and government scrutiny, and that does impact how it operates. Part of the change in how it's functioning and what it's doing will be because the key figures have gone. We've lost Pick. He left the London Transport Board in 1940 and he dies shortly thereafter, and in 1948 or 1947 Lord Ashfield departs from London Transport, and 11 months later he dies before the British Transport Commission is set up. Ashfield had moved to the BTC to help it set up, and he dies before it actually comes into taking ownership of the railways. So the key figures are gone, and the structure is changed. The organisation now has to fit completely within government spending requirements and scrutiny and all of that. And again, while Fowler argues that we are lucky in who was in charge of the LPTB in the 1930s, he also notes that it is that independence, it's that slight lack of scrutiny, it's the ability to just have the money and spend it how the board sees fit without Parliament actually scrutinising that spending, that allows it to just spend. They want to do a big, bold project. Well, the government's given them however many million to just
do it.
They spend 3.7. The UERL spends 2.6 million per year on average on investments. The LPTB spends about 6 million per year on investments. So it's a huge up in scale. And they're just spending that. They're spending that on new tube lines. If we think in the 1930s, we get the Bakerloo extension up to Stanmore, we get the Central Line extensions, the Northern Line extensions, we get some tram extensions, yes, but we get trolley buses and new buses and all of these things. And then post-war, it's managed decline. Essentially, not necessarily immediately from 1948, but the period leading up to the 1990s is essentially characterised by a period of managed decline, especially under the LCC or the GLC era from 1970 through to the mid 1980s, and then again towards the 90s under London Regional Transport. And so this means that whilst bold plans are drawn up, because during the end of the Second World War and immediately after it, several ambitious plans are drawn up. These include the London County Council's rebuilding of the London Area Plan, the 1944 Greater London Plan, and Abercrombie's 1948 Greater London Plan, which all propose a mad series of building projects.
Yeah, I would say it's on a scale that we have never seen before or since.
Yes.
At least in government spending, this is. as well. That's the other thing, is it's government spending.
The closest sort of examples I can think of are things like the programs in China to build metro systems in various cities.
Yes.
The closest in Europe I can think of is the Grand Paris Express. And even that pales in comparison to what Abercrombie is proposing. Essentially, I think he's basically proposing, for suburban traffic at least, the elimination of Termini station in London and a series of looping and through railways across London to link the various termini together. There's routes that take you like from London Bridge through Cannon Street, round the side of the Circle Line and back down to Victoria and stuff like that to connect the suburban services together.
It's insane, but also somewhat marvellous to think about.
It's also important to note, though, that as well as railway projects, it promotes a variety of road projects.
Yes, this is true.
Because it's of its time. For example, one of the wildest projects I noted was the idea of having a whole series of trunk roads under Bermondsey. Not Bermondsey, Bloomsbury.
I know the one you're talking about.
Specifically, there's a proposal for a roundabout pretty much directly underneath Senate House Library.
Brilliant.
Which I'm not sure that a large Portland stone building is particularly well supported by a roundabout, but...
And as we have found, I think, from more recent projects to do with roads and tunnels, it's not exactly what we would call a safe or good idea.
Or even pleasant. It's just unpleasant apart from anything else.
I don't know if anyone's had to use either the Dartford crossing tunnels or the... what are the horrible ones in London? The Blackwall Tunnel and the other one. The Rotherhithe Tunnel. They're all horrible.
But the Abercrombie report proposes lots of large-scale projects, and largely the railway projects just fall to the side. The roads kind of get a little bit of attention. So we get some works on the trunk roads. Britain's first motorway, the Preston Bypass, now part of the not the A6, the M6, opens in 1958. And there are a variety of road projects across the country and across London. There's widening of a variety of the trunk roads. That's stuff that started in the 1930s, as we talked about back in our episode on the history of the car, and continues on through the 1950s and 60s and 70s and into the 80s and 90s. Ultimately, the culmination of proposals for London is the Ringways project, which I'm sure many of our listeners will have heard about. And that is the proposal to put 3 concentric rings of motorway around London and a series of motorways coming almost into the city centre. So things like the West Way are remnants of that. The North Circular is meant to be... So it's the North and South Circular is the first ring. They're meant to be widened to full motorway standards. Only really the northeast corner of the North Circular ever ended up being upgraded. It's sort of that sort of 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock span of the North Circular gets widened to motorway standards. And even then, they're terrible motorway standards, I say as someone who's had to drive around the 406 plenty of times. You don't get the middle. The middle road just sort of vanishes, essentially. And then the outer... Well, the middle road doesn't... The middle ringway doesn't sort of disappear, sort of doesn't, because bits of it get incorporated into the M25, but mostly the M25 is the outer ringway.
And there are a couple spots on the M25 where you can see where they kind of stitch the two together, is the only way to put it. Like the motorway splits. I forget where it is. It splits the two parts split apart for what would have been a junction, and then come back together with no junction in sight. And
I think largely the use of the middle, if I'm remembering rightly, the use of the middle ringway was mostly to bring it closer in so it could go past Heathrow. Because the M25 actually runs quite close to London, or Greater London, really, when you get to Heathrow, because it wants to serve the airport. But ultimately, the cash is going to the roads in this period, and like the mainline railways, London Transport finds itself in a period of managed decline, and a period where it's having to not invest to the degree that it really should have. And this is one of the things that London still feels to this day, is the fact that in this period there's a dearth of construction. There is the first new trunk underground route to open is in 1968, and that is 60 years after the previous new trunk bit of underground railway on the Piccadilly line had opened. And this is the Victoria line, which is revolutionary. some point there's going to be an episode on the Victoria Line. No questions about it. There will be. I've got a report over there that talks about the massive inflow of passengers and notes, as we keep seeing with new railway projects to this day, that a large number of the passengers that use the Victoria Line cannot be accounted for by abstraction from other lines, because it creates new routes, it creates new journeys, it generates demand. And this is a thing we see all over the place.
It's also, I think, interesting to look at from a modern perspective, to think that the Victoria Line generates these routes, and then when one of the next big projects in London, we get Crossrail, can't even link up to really one of the newest tube lines in London because it will overwhelm it otherwise.
Yeah.
Which is the incredibly insane thing, is that like one of the busiest tube lines cannot be linked up to the new project, even though they pass, next to each other in places, because it will kill it.
Crossrail passes the Crossrail passes the Elizabeth line. Crossrail passes the Victoria line at Oxford Circus, but it deliberately doesn't stop there because, as you say, it would overwhelm the Victoria line and it would overwhelm Oxford Circus Station. And you get the Jubilee line in 1979, relieving the Bakerloo line. But then projects stop again for another 20 years. We don't get the Jubilee line extension until 1999. We get the Docklands Light Railway opening in the late 1980s, and you get Tramlink opening in the 2000s. But really, I can list the substantial public transport projects in London in the 60 years from 1948 through to, or 70 years from 1948 through to 2022 on a smaller sheet of paper than I can list the things that the LPTB did in the 8 years that it meaningfully, the 6 years that it meaningfully had to do things between 1933 and 1938.
And what's also really not, I would say in some ways it's quite sad, but also really interesting, is that a lot of these projects are ones the LPTB wouldn't have even been involved in too. Because Thameslink and Crossrail, Thameslink is a British rail project primarily.
Yeah, so I've got it noted on here that also, like the Abercrombie report with its idea of linking together suburban services doesn't come into being until 1989 at the earliest, and even then it's only Thameslink.
Yeah, and it's a British rail project, and Crossrail is, I'd say it's tangential to
Crossrail is an LU project.
Yeah,
Crossrail's always been Crossrail is a joint project between the National Rail Service and London Underground. It's always, because if you look at the 1992 proposals and everything, it's a joint London Underground project. So it's always been.
It's one of those ones which is not. I'd say it's a tangential project in that they're involved, but it's not entirely their own thing.
Yes.
And then Tramlink is a public-private thing. And it's not, and I mean, TfL comes into being at around the same time, and they're not involved in it at all, because it's the, I believe it's the Tramlink, I forget what it is, there was a private company that builds it.
It's all a bit weird because it does have it is kind of nested under London Regional Transit, and it does kind of end up nested under TfL when TfL comes into being. But it is, for a long time, it is sort of arm's length. It's now owned by TfL, and TfL owns the track and all of, like, TfL. I think in the end, TfL, if I'm remembering correctly, TfL end up buying the company that owns the infrastructure.
I think
because I think it's the case that LRT and then TfL initially have the right to pick the operator.
Yes,
but they don't own the infrastructure. They just like have the franchising right essentially. Tramlink's all a bit weird, and we are going to do, as those of you who have seen any of the tweets or any of the stuff I've put out about the origins of Rails to Nowhere know. Rails to Nowhere came out of a conversation of me and Ella sitting on the Tramlink, wondering about the Wimbledon-Croydon Railway and going, someone should do a sort of detailed podcast where they talk about the history of things like this and that. And we both want to do that episode on the Wimbledon to Croydon Railway, and we both want to do that episode that sort of looks at the history of the Tramlink and how it gets to where it is. We've just been distracted because ADHD.
Not just that, it's also a very complicated topic that has a lot of stuff that's should we say, not the easiest to get your hands on.
This is sometimes the problem with these sort of projects, because I want to do something on the Jubilee line and the Jubilee line extension, but the problem is we're just within the 30-year rule for a lot of these things.
Yes.
So the Jubilee line is looking much more likely because a lot of that stuff is now becoming accessible through the National Archive now.
Yes,
Tramlink,
it's the Westminster rules.
Maybe we're not going to wait until 2034 to talk about Tramlink, but it just sort of makes it a little more difficult to look at that because we're having to sort of look for old newspapers and old magazines and all of those sort of things to find the public information rather than being able to look at the documentation ourselves.
And when the times that we do get access to documentation, it requires a lot of communication, a lot of emails, a lot of work goes into accessing anything that's not just available through a search on the National Archives or other archival sources.
So
research is hard, is the summary.
Research is hard, research is complicated, and different research methods take different lengths of time. And I'm going to be doing a talk soon on how we've turned my dissertation and academic work into this podcast, and that's a whole thing as well. The complexity of sort of taking things we think of on an academic level and making it an accessible podcast. I'm wondering, I might suggest to Ella that we find some way of making the gist of that talk into a short. It's only going to be like a 15-20 minute talk, but maybe we have a sit down and we talk about that in a sort of bonus episode type thing, because I think that would be an interesting conversation to have more publicly.
And also, if anyone does work for things like Tramlink, TfL, British, well, not British Rail, the Rail Delivery Group, these organisations that would be interested, we have significant interest in, and you are able to talk to the people who release information, decide what is allowed to be released, please contact us. There are ways to do so. And if, in all seriousness, if anyone does work and I'm not talking like someone who can just go in and access documents, then maybe they should. I mean, people whose job is to decide if this stuff gets released or is like with the public relations, you know where to contact us. Please do, because I would be very interested in, I think Simon too, would be very interested in working with you to help produce, for us to be able to produce interesting episodes about your stuff. Please.
Yes.
Please.
Moving on, let's sort of reflect on what we've sort of talked about and how this sort of reflects on the modern situation. This conversation has naturally been very London-centric, and
yes,
I'm aware that some of our listeners are not in London, and some of our listeners will be sitting, listening to their radios. Who's listening to this on a radio? If you're listening to this on a radio, if you're listening to this on a 1930s wireless, then please do send us pictures.
Yes, please.
But some of our listeners will be listening to this and going, "You're talking about London and you're whinging about how London hasn't had enough investment, and yet London gets everything." And yes,
this
bluntly,
is true. London gets a lot of attention.
The problem is, London hasn't had everything it wants and everything that it needs, and hasn't had the investment that it should have. And yet you are, and so we are right that London is underfunded and has not had the investment it should have had. And you are also right that London gets all of the investment that there has been, or at least most. Because yes, you can also point to things like Metrolink and Sheffield Supertram and all of that and say, look, there have been things outside. Yes, there have been, but
they're not adequate.
No. Most of the tram networks that exist in the UK should have been metro systems, as an example of the scale of investment difference between what has been built and what should have been built.
And I think there's a few reasons for this too. I think, first of all, London serves as an excellent micro-study of the wider political forces.
Yes.
Because what London gets, what little that it gets compared to what it wants, I would say, serves as an amazing study of, well, if London, the biggest city that is the centre of the media, the centre of the economy, the centre of the government, which unlike other countries like Germany or America, United States of America, where these are split across several cities. For example, in Germany, when it was West Germany, it was split across
Bonn and Köln,
and Frankfurt and Dusseldorf,
and now throw Berlin into that mix.
Yep. And Berlin, and in America you have Washington DC, and
which is just
New
a politics
York.
hub, but then you have New York, and then you have industrial spaces all over the place. The only thing that London isn't the hub of in
LA.
the UK is industry.
Yes.
Historically, very little manufacturing has ever happened in London.
Yes. But it's the centre of the key three big things, I think.
Yes, but if it can only get these little handouts and little scrapings, then what hope has there been for anywhere else in the country? And yeah, you're right, it serves as a good sort of microcosm and as a good sort of case study, and that's one of the reasons that it interests me and that I've written about this. And so I think it is useful to reflect on what London could have been and what London should have been and what it should have got, and then reflect on the fact that that reflects even worse in other bits of the country where they've had even less investment.
And what's particularly notable about it as well is that it leads to, I think, a massive deficit for the United Kingdom as a whole.
Yes.
It's always been shown that building these massive infrastructure projects that allow people to travel quickly and for very little money, and most importantly as well, I think, being able to not just travel but be able to work, be able to have low stress travel, which is the other key thing. By not building this, the United Kingdom has hamstrung its economy in many ways.
Yes.
Without these projects, you end up in a position where people who are less well off, people who you would very much classify as poor or, not, or a very low income, are unable to access better jobs.
Yep.
You get to a position where people who have nice jobs are forced into, an hour-long, 2-hour-long commutes every day by car, which has been proven to be bad for people's mental health and their well-being, which then causes people to be less fit, which costs on the NHS.
Yep.
And it causes people to be stressed all the time. It's at every turn.
It's all interlinked.
It's all interlinked, and I think it has had massive effects on how the United Kingdom's economy has shaken out, and it's why we get things like the North is seen as very underdeveloped and very poor and has been missing out, while at the same time you get this impression that London gets everything it wants, while also every time it gets a project it just be instantly overwhelmed with demand because there's so much demand for it. So Thameslink
look at the last 4 projects in London: the Elizabeth line, Thameslink, the Jubilee line extension and the Victoria line, and they're all
Tramlink.
They're all overwhelmed. Tramlink, the Northern Line extension down to Battersea, that's full now as well. Yeah. Well, not full, but it can't cope. There's not enough trains going down to Battersea. Yeah. There aren't any more trains to send to Battersea, so it's
and the infrastructure doesn't really allow for it.
No.
Which is the other problem. The infrastructure just hasn't been built to support it.
No.
And it's why we get things like discussion about what if we split the Northern Line in 2? Yeah. Well, you essentially need to buy a second train fleet to support that. Yeah. And I'm not talking like 15, 20. I'm talking an entire 50, 60 train fleet that the Northern Line already has. Yep. It's insane the amount of work that has to be done to account for this debt.
Yes. But I find it interesting that I agree with, I think Gareth co-signed it or was part of Gareth Dennis was part of it, but it was an article written by John Bull for the Manchester Evening News about how actually investment in places that are not London should be a thing that Londoners are supporting and wanting to happen, because we're kind of in a cycle that London is the place that gets everything, and then the investment doesn't happen elsewhere, so people don't move elsewhere. Anyway, this is not politics today. This is a history podcast, although history is obviously tied to politics. We're running a little bit out of our recording time, so I just want to sort of
I was
round
going
off.
to say, can I have a
Sorry, go on.
positive note thing
Yep,
too?
have a positive note.
I think it's also important to look back at these investments that are made and go, well, we could do it back then. We can do it again. We can be the people who build insane big projects and just do it.
Yep.
And I think it's something we should actually start looking at, because we saw with the road projects, when Britain wants to do a big project, it can do a big project.
Yes.
So there is no excuse to not do the big projects. We should be doing them. And it just requires the political will, and also the will of not just the politicians but the people too, to want this stuff. And I think people do want it in general, but it's making sure that your voice is heard.
Yeah, and so I'm going to round off now with a sort of concluding statement,
Yes.
because ultimately this is my dissertation, it's my conclusions and stuff, and so I want to sort of round that off. And I think we've answered the question of was the LPTB successful in addressing the demands of London in the 1930s and in pushing back against motor travel? And I think largely, yes, they were, and they were very successful in expanding the network and putting new services in places to try and encourage transport users to use public transport. Even if the general trends towards the motor car during the 1930s meant that there was almost certainly a sort of doomed mission to try and eliminate the motor car's growth in London. But what I think the LPTB era in London's transport shows significantly is the power of technocracy. Now, I'd like to make it clear that I do believe that there should be some level of accountability to public organisations, and I think that we should be having Parliament be able to oversee to an extent what's happening. But I think the really big thing that the era shows is that when you have a organisation that is run solely to be a technocratic organisation and solely run to do things, to spend the money as it sees fit based on its professional opinion, that actually you end up with that body having the ability to do that and the freedom to do that and the freedom to just invest. All too often throughout the last sort of 50, 60 years, we've really seen major projects and major organisations hamstrung by political interference. Things like the Victoria Line and the Jubilee Line extensions they're all tied up with political red tape and flip-flopping from Parliament, even though the planners at London Transport and so on know what they want to get done and actually have very solid plans to do. And again, other projects like Crossrail or HS2, we find becoming increasingly convoluted and complex and a farcical nature whence the whims of politicians begin to take precedence over the plans for a public transport network. And that's not to say that I think that we should just ignore people. I don't think that we should just build a railway through somebody's house without talking to them. I think that's wrong, but I think it's important that we look back at this sort of era and we actually understand the power of actually listening to professionals. It was said very recently, or not very recently actually, it was back in 2015-16 now during the Brexit referendum, that Britain is fed up with experts. And the problem there is I don't think we should be. I think we should be listening more to experts. We should actually be understanding that they have a professional and an expert opinion and they should actually be taking the lead on these things. And yes, there will always be some political concerns. There will always be some necessity to listen to people. There will be heritage concerns, there will be compromises that have to be made, there will be these discussions to be had. But actually, ultimately, British Rail is often hamstrung throughout its history by political interference and by the government balking at the cost of projects. The thing that the LPTB had in its favour is, as Fowler says, the capacity to just take money from the government and just spend it as it sees fit and not have the government come and go, oh, but are you sure that spending that money on a new tube extension is really good value for money? And they can just go, actually, we want to invest in the network. And I think we as a society, as a government, as a country, need to relearn the importance of investing in our infrastructure and remember that when you build it, they will come.
Yes, and I think it's also about making the benefits of the experts visible, and also, I suppose, for lack of a better term, they make it look sexy.
Yes.
Make it look good. Because if there's one thing about Crossrail, is especially that core section, it looks really good.
It really does.
Never mind the issues of things like them having to vinyl over.
It's a bit bland in places.
Some shadows, but it looks impressive. It looks gargantuan, and it's awe-inspiring.
Could have done with nicer design though to make it a little bit more catchy though, and make the stations more unique. As me and Emily and Paul were talking about, the problem with the Crossrail stations is they're all the same when you're on the train.
Yes, but it's about making it look. It's about making it appealing to the public, because if you ask Londoners, was Crossrail worth it now, they all will probably all go, yes, it was. And if you ask them, is it impressive, they'll go, yes, it is, look at it. It's about pushing that on people, that we can do big things, we can make things that look cool and that benefit us, and we should do it.
Yeah, we should. But that really brings us to the end of this episode, brings us to the end of our conversation. This will probably, again, like the last one, mostly be a live to tape, they say with quotation marks, type episode, because it's come in at just under an hour on the recording, and I don't think there's a lot that needs editing out of this one, really.
No.
Our next episodes will be on Ella's dissertation on the Jersey railways and tramways. And finally, at long last. And then, as I said last episode, we'll take a little bit of a break to put things on while we're cooking up the next set of episodes. I think we're starting to formulate a plan on what those are going to be, and I'm really excited for that, but we'll speak more. Because the problem is, when I say we're going to write an episode on this, that, or the other now, in 4 months' time, we'll have written an episode on something completely different, and I'm just setting myself up for a fall, so I'm not going to promise what we're talking about yet. We'll release more to our patrons later in the year, hopefully. I'm also not going to say we're going to be back in the summer or in the autumn, because I'm just shooting myself in the foot if I say that.
We'll be back soon.
We'll be back. I remember when we first started this, when we were just getting our groove and sort of thinking about, we're like, oh, we're going to do monthly, and then we were like, oh, we're going to do it like this number of... What we've decided is we're going to go for the case of we're going to plan a few episodes, we're going to write them up, and then we're going to release them as a chunk when they're ready. If you think more like a CGP Grey style releasing schedule, more like Round or Round We Go have ended up with, of sort of like, when we've got some episodes ready, we will put them out. You will all get them as a nice little chunk.
Research is expensive,
and I need a bit of a pause from it, because this series of episodes has been a marathon task. I didn't anticipate how big a task converting my dissertation to this number of episodes was going to be, and they were meant to be initially. The initial plan was for like 3 more episodes.
Yeah, and I've got to do some, should we say, some polishing of the Jersey one too.
Yeah. But we'll speak to you next time for Jersey stuff. Yes. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Yes, goodbye.
This episode of Rails to Nowhere was presented and produced by me, Simon Sartis & Co, and Eleanor Ashton. Principal research was carried out by myself, with contributions from Eleanor. Rails to Nowhere is brought to you by our fantastic patrons over at patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere, especially our £10 and above patron, Valkyrie Lemons. Thank you very much for your support. If you'd like to help Rails to Nowhere for as little as £2 per month, then you can do so by heading over to patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere. Otherwise, you can connect with us on social media over at twitter.com/Rails to Nowhere, or search Rails to Nowhere podcast over on Instagram. Until next time, thank you for listening and have a good day.